non ti dimentichi dei poveri. E quella parola è entrata qui, i poveri, i poveri.
Jobs, cooking, cleaning, bathing, toileting, looking after the daily needs of children and the elderly. Respect or access to high-level decision-making to women who spend their lives providing care.
Make proposals as village. Our village is called Work and Care. So
to this second webinar of the economy of Francesco.
Everything that you did to the smallest of my brothers, you did for me. This is what animates everything that I do.
So we want to get everybody over the social foundation into the green donut ring itself. Nobody left behind in the whole is the need to distribute the capacity to generate wealth. And again, thank you, Sophie, for this beautiful, beautiful image of capturing.
Hi everyone, it's such a pleasure and honor to have Professor Sachs with us, so thank you for being here.
It's important to start with the ancients, with the Greeks, and with the ideas of happiness, and to understand how the message from the ancient Greeks, from Jesus at the Sermon on the Mount.
Thank you again, Professor Capra.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here to enhance the good growth and diminish the bad growth. Now, from an ecological point of view, this distinction between good growth and bad growth is obvious. As I said in my presentation, that this idea of unlimited growth on a finite planet is completely irrational.
Come agisce anche in quei paesi, viste le esigenze differenti, il movimento di Slow Food?
Grazie a te, perché questo mi dà l'opportunità di mettere in evidenza una questione molto importante.
La lente di ingrandimento, il tema dell'agricoltura. Con la tua produzione
si cerca la qualità, la quantità rispetto alla qualità. Siamo arrivati a una situazione insostenibile, veramente non è più possibile pensare che questo sistema alimentare possa continuare a fare tanti danni.
They wrote some 2 papers recently on that topic, and they will share with us some of the results we just discovered.
Pleasure for us to be at this such a nice event. So let me start.
We must create economic value, we must create employment, we must reduce environmental risk, we must reduce pandemic risk, we must be richer of time, and we must be richer of sense of life, because our goal of civil economics is generativity, sense of life.
I'm also great to be part of the economy of Francesco. I'm very happy to be. And again, thanks for the very interesting work. I think it's really important because
So for me, it's very interesting to be here today together with you, and as you can see, a very interesting group of speakers.
Blueprint is a charity that essentially shows a pathway to build good at scale.
The human development that comes about because of what we do in business and because of the kind of contribution.
So here's my question. What have been the challenges that you have experienced to create this new mindset of relationship?
We don't actually have to attract the late majority. We just have to get to a certain tipping point, which I believe is somewhere around 15 or 18% of adoption in society of ideas, of technology.
Work on in the coming months towards the event in November. Yes.
And building trust in a context of violence is very difficult. And I don't have to prove this to you, coming from a country like Colombia that has suffered so much about an internal conflict that seems to be endless. And still today we're struggling, even after a peace agreement with the oldest guerrilla that has survived in the modern times in history.
Peace, in my perspective, is a matter of institution, because it's nothing but a comprehensive set of rules governing behaviors of individuals, of firms, of governments, and all the economic agents we have.
Our village in the economy of Francesco is focused on the businesses and how actually businesses are transitioning and moving into a more sustainable economy.
You know, the old American style capitalist, make money, make profits for the shareholders kind of thing, at the exclusion of everything else.
But I saw in my experience that big enterprises are constantly afraid of being exposed.
And just embracing the fact that this information is going to come out, and basically adopting just new methods of approaching the whole development of the science and the whole development of potentially new products in a way that embraces that.
So good evening, everyone. My name is Andrea Roncella. I am the junior coordinator of the Finance and Humanity Village. Thanks for being here with us today. Before presenting our main guest, a few technical notices. The first one is that translations are available in Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish. And you can find the link on the YouTube chat if you are interested at. And second, we are looking to have some questions at the end of the webinar. So please use the Q&A button if you're following us on the Zoom link or on the YouTube chat, and we will find a way to read them. I will give the word to Suor Alessandra, who will say a few words about the economy of Francesco and our village. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm Sister Alessandra Smerilli. I'm the coordinator of the Finance and Humanity Village, one of the 12 villages of Economy of Francesco. And this village is working on finance and young people, young researchers, economists, and entrepreneurs and change makers are making proposals in order to change today's economy and to give a soul to the economy of tomorrow. And I'm pleased to say that a few days ago, I spoke to Pope Francis, and I told him all the massive job young people are doing in this village and in the process of economy of Francesco. And he told me, I like this. I really like this. Please go ahead. So this is the message from the Pope. And I hope also this seminar, and thank you to Mariana Mazzucato for being here, that this seminar can be a step towards a better economy and towards concrete proposals on how to change the economy of today. So thank you and have a nice seminar.
Thank you. Thank you, Suor Alessandra. So we are very excited to have here today with us Mariana Mazzucato, who is one of the most active intellectual, I would say, in the public debate nowadays. She is professor in the economics of innovation and public value at the University College London, where she is also founding director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. I guess you know her in particular for her two highly acclaimed books. The first one is the Entrepreneurial State, the banking public versus private sector myths, where she actually investigates the critical role the state plays in driving growth. And the second one, more recent, that is the value of everything, making and taking in the global economy, where she looks at how value creation needs to be rewarded over value extraction. We decided to invite her today, first of all, because in her last book, she undertakes, I would say, several critiques about the current functioning of the financial sector, or maybe better said, about the financialization of the economy. Nonetheless, she obviously acknowledges the critical role that finance has to allow buyers and sellers to do business. And in doing so, how actually finance can contribute to the value creation processes. And it is in particular the debate around this value creation that triggered our attention as a Finance and Humanity Village, since we guess that this topic has become even more critical in the afterwards of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we had a brainstorming within our village in the past weeks to think a little bit about this value creation process, and we would like to have a conversation with you, Mariana, today. So thanks again for having accepted our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Great, and I'll put on my timer so I don't go over. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Great,
okay. So I'm gonna start quite broad, and I think maybe what will be good is if in the discussion we can go into the details of particular financial policies or instruments, and I'll speak about finance, but it's really about why we need a particular type of finance, and also just reminding ourselves that, you know, finance is not neutral, and that's a really important kind of first place to begin, because there's so much finance right now coming into the system, as there always is. There's always a lot of money that comes in when there's a crisis, whether it's a financial crisis, a last minute reaction to a climate crisis. You'll remember there was fires in Australia and California, floods in Venice, and, you know, we have to wait for those kind of tragic climate emergencies to decide to do something. And now with the health pandemic, there's trillions being poured into the system. And that's good. It means that we're reacting, but if we don't structure that finance, if we don't structure our policies in such a way that allows us to achieve, I think, what the Vatican and Pope Francis and, you know, basically also, you know, early kind of Jesuit thinking called the common good, then we fail. Because finance can do a lot of harm. As you mentioned, I've written a book called The Value of Everything, where I actually begin by looking at how finance has been looked at in the history of economic thought. And it's quite interesting that the early economists were very clear. They worried about these issues. So the physiocrats back in the 1700s, when they made the famous tableau économique, where they really looked, in some ways, it was the first kind of spreadsheet ever in the 1700s. They were very concerned with how value is being circulated in the system. So they began with this notion of, you know, value being created in agriculture by the farmers. And then they kind of created this simulation, basically, again, 17th century version of it, looking at how that value that was produced in agriculture then circulated. And they looked at the merchant class, the landlords, and they were especially worried about too much money that was going from the land, no longer being reinvested in the land to make it more productive, but getting siphoned out to either the merchants or, even worse, the landlords, who they really saw as like the sterile class. They believed that if too much money was extracted out of the system, then the system would become sterile, a very strong word. In other words, it wouldn't reproduce itself. And when we think today about sustainability, it's not only sustainability in terms of our climate targets, and that's the most important, you know, way to think about sustainability. We need to be nurturing the planet's ability to, you know, prosper people, animals, plants, everything, but also literally the system to reproduce itself, like, you know, production to have its second round, its third round, instead of just a one-off, because then, you know, finance is not going back into the productive structure itself. So the physiocrats were very worried about this. The early classical economists, so Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, and neoclassical economics basically lost its view of what I call the kind of objective conditions in the economy. And by objective, I don't mean like deterministic. I literally mean looking at kind of who's doing what, whether you're looking at the health sector, the energy sector, the platform technologies today, who are the different actors, how are they organized? You know, Adam Smith's famous book, The Wealth of Nations, was all about that. He looked at the division of labor, the division of innovative labor, and he really believed that unless the kind of system of production was done in a dynamic and efficient way where resources were plowed back into organizational innovation and later technological innovation, which Ricardo and Marx talked more about, then the system would kind of fall apart. So he looked at productivity as a result of division of labor and organizational innovation, productivity, which then increases growth, which then increases the wealth of nations. And really what neoclassical economics did, I think, was to reverse the logic. Instead of looking at where does value come from, is it going back into the system? Is it getting siphoned out? You know, is the system kind of losing its ability to reproduce itself? Basically, we just started to look at exchange. And exchange, you know, if you look at all the different, you know, individual decisions that the consumers are making, maximizing their individual utility, firms maximizing their individual profits, workers maximizing their individual decisions of leisure versus work, you aggregate up those decisions, you get your nice supply and demand curves, you get prices, whether they're equilibrium or disequilibrium, and those prices reveal value. So instead of having a theory of value, you know, again, dynamic, we shouldn't think objective as, you know, a hardcore theory of value. If you read Marx, it was all about innovation, also Ricardo and Smith. Instead of having a theory of value and attention of what's happening in that circular flow, and then having kind of almost a theory of price and exchange that flows from that, the reverse happened. So it went from objective to subjective. It's all about individuals making their individual decisions, but also the logic went from price to value all of a sudden, instead of from value to price. And that, I think, has made it really hard for us to have a proper dashboard on what's happening in the economy, because prices don't tell us very much. You know, now, by the way, under COVID, you'll know that just some months ago, even, so, you know, like in April, the US stock market was doing even better. You know, the stock market itself, stock prices aren't necessarily a good judgment, but also prices, if we're looking at all the different activities in the economy, we know, for example, that care is very important. Just because it doesn't have a price, you know, it doesn't go into GDP, or when we pollute, GDP will go up. So those are all, you know, longstanding problems that people have written about. I think what's less understood is how, you know, there's a whole area called finance, which has been growing over the last kind of 50 to 60 years. And that didn't used to go into GDP, most of it. It was seen as a transfer. So up until 1970, most of the financial sector was not included in GDP because it was still seen, not explicitly, they didn't use these words, but basically just a transfer of existing value. Kind of, you know, like rent. If we wanted to use, again, the physiocrats and the political, the classical political economy words. When it started to grow as much as it did, then, up until then, all that was included in GDP was those bits of finance that actually earned an explicit price. Like if you went to get a mortgage, you had to pay a fee, say, to the person giving you a mortgage, that went into GDP. But net interest payments, that's what was seen just as a transfer. And what's interesting is that then from 1970 on, those people globally who were looking, for example, in the UN at how to systematize our national accounting, the group at the SNA kind of office in the UN basically decided to put in these net interest payments simply because they were growing, and that was actually seen because it was income being earned. Oh, it's income being earned, it must be valuable. Again, logic, price to value. And instead of pausing a minute and looking at global finance and what was actually happening, which would have been really useful with that kind of objective physiocratic eye to, you know, what kind of finance is doing what, who's earning what and why, it just went in. And I think today, more than just worrying about happiness indicators and well-being indicators, as important as they are in terms of enriching our measures of GDP, we should also be cleaning the house. Like my husband always says, because I love going to antique markets, he says, for every little trinket you bring in, 3 things out. I don't listen to him, I just hide it in different parts of the house. The same thing I think with GDP. Let's first get some stuff out before we bring in this much richer set of indicators. And basically what I mean by out is rent. So rent as unearned income, and rent as certain things in the economy, literally just moving things around, or even worse, destroying value. Let's be careful before we just give it a name and put it in, because that's what basically happened with net interest payments. They went in to the national income and product accounts, as services that were being produced. So commercial banks, the service was called financial intermediation, and investment banks, risk-taking. And it's quite interesting that it's called risk-taking services for investment banks, given that when, I was going to say a swear word, but I can't do this if I'm doing this with this wonderful audience here. But when things go bad, that's my euphemistic way, and too much risk is taken and the financial system collapses, who bails out the big investment banks? Well, the taxpayer. And so it's quite interesting that this so-called risk that investment banks take, when they then get bailed out, like Goldman Sachs did in 2009, $10 billion bailout by the taxpayer, that should again wake us up to, oh, maybe we shouldn't call them, risk taking services, given that then that risk is absorbed by someone else. Anyway, sorry for this preliminary rant, but I think it's useful in terms of setting the context. What I actually want to now focus on in the next 20 minutes, don't worry, I'm keeping track here. That's what women do, by the way. They always stick to time. I find that on the panels that I'm on, the women are the ones with the timers to make sure they don't go over. What I'd like to do is just to say why this is so important right now, to kind of go back to questioning what is the value in the economy, what is the value of the type of finance we have, and what are we valuing? And by the way, with the health pandemic, I think it's such a good moment to ask lots of these questions. Partly also because we're using words like valuable when we think of things like essential workers. In every country, health workers and frontline workers have been called something differently, but here in the UK, we've called it essential workers or key workers, same in the US. And the idea is that these people have been so essential, they've been allowed to keep kind of working while many others were locked down. And this is quite allowed to, in the sense that we all have relied on them, and they're an essential part of the economy. We clapped on Thursdays, and yet what's extraordinary is that is a part of the economy that we have no idea how to value. Literally, in countries that have, proper welfare states, or even have a welfare state, many don't, where you have public health services. You should remember, many countries don't have public health services. We don't, again, because of what I was talking about before, know how to value services that are free. So we end up only valuing the cost, right? So the cost of nurses and doctors, or of school teachers with a public education system, goes into GDP. But the actual value that is produced, we don't really know how to do that because it doesn't have a price. And this is why it becomes really hard to even talk about things like the productivity of our education system, because we only know how to measure the input. Whereas I often joke that in 2009, Lloyd Blankfein, the head of Goldman Sachs, dared to say that Goldman Sachs workers were the most productive in the world. And this is, again, a year after they were bailed out $10 billion by the US taxpayer. And it's interesting because you can laugh at it, but he wasn't laughing. It wasn't a joke. But he's right. He was actually right. Because we have a tautology that we confuse price with value. If you're earning a very high income, which, as you'll know, investment bankers do earn, then if that reveals their value, well, then of course they're the most productive. Anyway, so this really is a moment to pause and to say, okay, we're using words like essential work. What does that actually mean? Have we been valuing such an essential part of the economy? And if not, then we should not just clap healthcare workers. We should actually be resourcing those institutions that we rely on, which is the healthcare service, healthcare industry, and really think through how to think about that much more broadly than just say hospitals. And that is where these notions of well-being and wellness and happiness do come back in, but we need to think of it much more than just about accounting, but really resourcing those services. And again, public education, making sure that the digital divide is not getting wider, and that our school system is not just resilient, doesn't just have money, but is as good as can be, and is especially serving everyone, but especially the most vulnerable children, which is definitely not happening. I'm seeing this in London, massive problem right now with the lockdown, where my own kids have much better access to all sorts of things, including broadband, and they continue to, get their opportunities satisfied, whereas many children do not, let alone in the developing world. Anyway, so, this period we're living through is dramatic. but it can also create an opportunity for us. And we should remember, as I mentioned in the beginning, that in these dramatic periods, yes, government comes back, but that's not enough. It already came back in the financial crisis, and most of the money that was put into the system, filled the system with liquidity, basically just went back to the financial sector because it wasn't accompanied by proper structures that could really direct that finance in ways that became more useful to protecting us against the next crisis. In fact, one of the key causes of the financial crisis back in 2007 and 8 was very high levels of private debt, not public debt, private debt. And if you look around the world, many countries, including the UK and the US, which in some ways were the epicenters of the financial crisis, are back at record levels of private debt to disposable income. So, if you're not already very worried about COVID and climate, guess what? You should also be very worried about the pending financial crisis, because we're back at the levels of debt that, again, were one of the key causes of it. So we really need to wake up, and we need to be structuring the remedies, the different solutions that are being put on the table in a way that are, again, structured towards the common good, public interest, public value, public purpose, these words that I might tease out a bit more also in the discussion. But that is the reason I've set up a whole institute around it called the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And it's really about highlighting again and bringing up to the surface this notion of how do we structure a system towards the common good. And the other thing is, and I'm sure you all know this, but we really need to resist going back to normal. Normal is what got us the financial crisis. Normal is what got us the climate crisis. And for sure, if you look at some of the scientific papers coming out about COVID and what caused it, there's lots about how we consume, produce, and distribute that contributed to the way that today we are getting closer and closer to viruses that we cannot, that we're not used to, and that are causing these pandemics. And so what, just to quickly break down and to give you a flavor of just how bad normality is and how we should not go back to normal, finance is not good when it's normal. Normal finance has basically gone back, as I mentioned, to the financial sector. Something like 80% of global finance goes to finance, insurance, and real estate. A lot of it goes to real estate. And if you look at how much has gone to mortgages globally, with this, just today was announced again in the UK, help to buy. So people are buying things that they can't even afford because real wages haven't gone up. But this kind of emphasis on getting people to buy homes that they can't afford and helping them do that, putting them into greater debt, is what has also increased asset bubbles in the housing sector. And as I mentioned before, finance isn't neutral. So if you look at the structure of global finance, a lot of it is short-term, a lot of it is impatient, even the good bits of finance, right? So not the credit default swaps and hedge funds, but the bits that we like to romanticize, like venture capital. A lot of VC is very problematic. It's exit driven. They want to exit through a buyout or an IPO. And I basically have specialized for many years in looking at how finance and innovation co-evolve. And what I've seen is that in many sectors like biotechnology, nanotechnology, clean technology today, and space technology today, that impatient financing, which is exit driven, messes things up. So in biotech, for example, we ended up with a lot of PLIPOs, as my colleague used to call it, productless IPOs. So the rush to have an initial public offering to satisfy the VC financing model is not good for science-based sectors. And so many of the sectors we care about, for example, those underpinning a green transition, need time. And time is also important to learn. When we talk about, learning how to ride a bike, if someone's pushing you and saying, learn, bah, you're going to fall off the bike. And in many sectors, learning by doing is very important, and patient finance actually helps us learn. So that's why, normality is not good in finance. It's also not good in the real economy. So in the corporate world, we've seen over the last 10 years, a lot of impatience there as well, a lot of financialization. So $3 trillion have been spent just in the last 10 years by the Fortune 500 companies to just buy back their shares, to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. And that basically is what the physiocrats were worried about. That's a form of sterility, of getting value out of the system. And that would be fine if it's now and then, but we've seen sort of increasing trends towards this precisely because of the focus on quarterly returns and stock prices. And that, of course, has contributed to falling aggregate investment. You'll remember that GDP, as imperfect as it is still actually quite useful to look at least at the differences between consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, the kind of basic GDP equation. And many countries have been growing from kind of, debt-fueled consumption, not investment, but this is also because of these problems of financialization. So profits not getting reinvested back in the economy. You actually see this if you look at the aggregate I and C plus I plus G plus X minus M. That is one of the lead drivers also of inequality. We know that there's real issues in terms of how wages have not kept up with productivity, but that's both a problem on the bargaining side. We know trade unions have gotten weaker, but it's also part of this investment crisis. Skills, right, human capital, and all the kind of knowledge that workers also develop on the shop floor, not just through government training programs, is an endogenous function of investment. So if investment is being extracted out, then skills will suffer. And this is very important when we think of things like the just transition, which is on the table now with the green transition. That shouldn't just be about, oh, let's protect the workers that are getting unemployed from one sector to another. That really should be about looking at corporate governance and public-private relationships and making sure that workers this time get a good deal in terms of the Green Deal. The deal bit is just as important as the green bit, and it has not been a good deal. And lastly, besides the climate problem, which I've already mentioned, lastly, a huge problem with normality is the state. The state has, when I say the state, I mean all its different institutions, has really been kind of hollowed out. We don't really have dynamic, kind of capable capacity within our state institutions. A lot of that has been outsourced or simply underfinanced. I already mentioned the question around health services. And I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. As long as you think that at best the state can just fix a market failure, and that's at best, that's like a good thing, then there's no real reason to invest in intra-organizational public kind of knowledge creation, learning capacity, governance mechanisms that go beyond the kind of, pushing the papers around, administering, regulating, fixing markets, and these really boring words like leveling the playing field. If you level the playing field, you're not going to get anything. You're not going to get a green transition, but you're also not going to get Silicon Valley. You're not going to get the internet. You're not going to get GPS. All the things in this phone, all the technology in this phone came from massive state investments as well as private investments, which were not about leveling, but kind of, governments making a decision to push the IT revolution. We need that same bold decision-making around all the SDGs and the green transition. And just in terms of climate, which I have mentioned, we're just not doing it. Like, it's just not happening. Things are going badly. Just in 2019, the subsidies to fossil fuel companies in the US were $20 billion, and in Europe, 55 billion. So that's just like a year ago, not even. Anyway, so COVID, unfortunately, makes all this worse, right? So inequality, as we know, the people being hit most by the crisis are the most vulnerable. And in terms of also the sickness, BAME, people in the US have definitely been the most hit. Poor people globally who just haven't had access to proper health services have definitely been the most hit. But also the economic crisis, which will and is happening, of course, will hit the vulnerable the most. But also debt. I already mentioned private debt was very high. Back in September even, well, it's going to get higher now because many companies are taking out loans. And even though there's a mortgage freeze for some people, that doesn't mean that it's been eliminated. They will find a very high mortgage bill in the autumn. Anyway, so this is the depressing bit, right? And if you're not already depressed, then that means you've been either smoking something very good or you're just very happy that you're about to go on vacation. But the good thing is that I really genuinely believe this is a great opportunity for change. The negotiation that happened in the European Commission last week shows a level of solidarity in Europe we haven't seen for a very long time. the willingness to actually redistribute, to create money and redistribute it, between the regions that need it the most, but especially to direct that finance towards really important goals, both health, but also the Green Deal and the digitalization agenda. So, this is huge, by the way, because you'll remember that in Europe, anytime we gave money to countries like Italy, where some of you are sitting, Greece and Spain, the conditions were, oh, we'll give you this money if you cut your deficit. That's not yet happening. The money is there and you have to show you have a strategy for long run growth. Like, wow, okay, that's a good condition. And they especially want strategies around climate and around digitalization. And there's also a pot for health. It's not perfect. I was not happy to see that the Horizon budget was reduced, that the Just Transition budget was reduced, but hey, this is much better than, the old kind of troika dynamic of here's some money, but as long as you basically cut all the things that we know are, matter towards, how citizens live. So the reason I'm also very encouraged is we should remember that we have the Sustainable Development Goals, and they are relatively new if you look at kind of, the history of capitalism, and they really can be used to direct this finance that's coming in. Already by putting these conditions around climate and digitalization and health that shows it's being directed, but there's also a Green Deal globally in many countries, at least being discussed. So the more we can be careful and make sure that we don't do what we did with the financial crisis, which was just flood the system with liquidity and pray, the more we can make sure that this money coming in, and in the US, it's over $2 trillion practically, that we don't just use it to bail out companies that then just become part of the problem, that we structure, including conditionalities attached when it comes to companies, then it's a great opportunity. And we've seen this happen in some countries, like in France, Denmark, and Austria. I'm just thinking of some of the European countries. They've been quite bold in creating these conditions. So Macron said very clearly, we're not there to save industry, we're there to transform it. So he produced some quite strong conditions attached for Renault, the car manufacturer, Air France, the airline, that they had to reduce their carbon emissions in order to get the massive loan that was provided. It was a combination of grants and loans in terms of how different industries are accessing this. In Denmark, even, amazing, they said, oh, and if you use tax havens, sorry, get back of the line or don't even bother lining up. So a change in corporate governance, a change in kind of going from short-term to long-term, change in terms of going towards green transition strategies as part of the deal of the COVID recovery. But that has not happened everywhere. In fact, I think those unfortunately are exceptions. I think they're very promising exceptions. We need to learn from them, but we need to ask, what does it mean if you actually scale that up towards just a new view of what capitalism is about? And this notion of stakeholder capitalism, as opposed to shareholder value maximization, is really what these conditionalities help us produce. And I was in Davos this year, so was Augusto Zampini, who I've been working with very closely in the Vatican, along with, of course, Alessandra Smerilli. We were both in Davos, and that's all people talked about this year and last year and sort of the year before. Purpose this, purpose that, stakeholder, but then there's no walk. They don't walk the talk. And many companies, again, are not walking the talk. They're just asking for the money because they're having problems. So making sure that we don't see stakeholder capitalism as a purely corporate governance issue, but as a new way to frame the interrelationships between all the different actors in the economy, putting purpose at the center. And purposeful finance matters if there's a relationship with what is being financed. And those dialogues, whether it's through, including with citizens, so citizen assemblies being at the table to even decide whether a city, Copenhagen, Medellin, Johannesburg, if we're going to have green cities, who's at the table in the first place, defining the missions, the challenges. That matters also very much with stakeholder capitalism. But I'm very interested as an economist in making sure that the structure, literally the nitty-gritty contracts, the deal of procurement contracts, grants and loans, embodies that purpose, that stakeholder element, because that money flowing in the system, again, the physiocrats looking at money flowing, not just in terms of reinvestment. I'm interested in how is it flowing? What's in the contracts, literally in terms of the deal. So if Elon Musk, this is pre-COVID, is, flying up into space a lot and in the meantime, creating lots of debris, literally garbage in space. So the astronauts are like, we can't see. That's not a very healthy symbiotic system, given that he's been doing all this work on the back of huge amounts of public money in space. And that kind of both free riding problem, but especially kind of parasitic, sometimes predator-prey kind of ecosystem in the health sector, where lots of public money goes in, but then the prices of the drugs don't reflect it. The patent system is abused. We see this, by the way, with both the vaccine for COVID and the remdesivir drug that Gilead is charging over $3,000 per dosage, even though 70 million went in from the taxpayer. All these different sectors, whether it's the platforms, the space, energy, or health, can be restructured so that the public money going in is structured in a more mutualistic, common good framing. So the public-private relationship is more interested and stakeholder driven. And lastly, because I'm beyond time and I've realized I haven't said half of what I was going to say, but that's fine because we'll have a discussion. Lastly, I've been working in recent years with the Commission and now with many different countries and cities on this concept of moonshots. And I do think it's quite useful. In other words, if you think of what got us to the moon 50 years ago, it wasn't just an enormous amount of public money through NASA, the space agency. It was lots of private initiative. There was Motorola, Honeywell, General Electric, also some small companies. But there was procurement contracts that NASA put out because they needed a lot of things to be done. But it was a common mission, and they did one of the most inspirational feats ever, getting to the moon and back again in a generation. And we need to learn from that intersectoral and bottom-up, but purpose-driven collaboration, co-investment, and sharing of risks, but also sharing the rewards along the way, really structuring that relationship in such a way that it wasn't rent-seeking, it wasn't speculative, but there was a common kind of goal. And I really think that the SDGs, all 17 of them, and the 169 targets beneath them, are simply not going to happen unless we have a moonshot approach to them. Actually, I have a new book coming out in January on this, but in the meantime, I helped the European Commission create a missions instrument. It was voted on, and I've been very interested in seeing how it's playing out. And if people want to know a bit more, we can talk about it. But I do think that unless we have new instruments, new institutions, new relationships, new contracts, all this talk about purpose and doing things in a more common good way, unfortunately, just remains cocktail hour talk. And we need to get serious on the details.
Thank you, Mariana. It was very powerful, very inspiring. And I guess, at least in my opinion, your talk poses very, different challenges. And I think that one that maybe can lead a little bit the first question that Agustina is going to pose is about the who. So who is going to decide, even these goals that we would like to pursue. So you mentioned the Sustainability Development Goals, of course. And we would like maybe to know a little bit more about the role of the state in all these debate. So Agustina.
Hello, Mariana. First of all, thank you for being here and for this wonderful presentation. As you said, the response to the pandemic emergency puts once again the role of the state and economy at the center of the public debate. Your work and this presentation actually addresses how governments have huge roles in orienting both decision and investment in areas that shape our economic system, such as innovation, but as seen today, also in digitalization, sustainability, workers' health, etc. How can we transform and reinforce the state without falling in a passive trust? And how can we avoid this pendulum effect that we see today, maybe, that is like going from an excess of markets to an uncontrolled state action? With this, the state we talk about may be possible only if we manage to strengthen civil society and the tissues of the public arena as a broader space than just the state. I'm talking about alliances, collaboration, partnerships, networks, etc. In this sense, which are the roles of subsidiarity and civil society in the recovery of this state's role? Thank you very much. The microphone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are we doing one answer? Are you collecting some, or should I? I'm happy to answer this
sure.
first.
If you can answer, it's fine.
I prefer that, because otherwise I always forget. I'm getting old. Thank you so much, Agustina. That's a fantastic question. And I think it was sort of divided in two, wasn't it? Which is, what is the state's role? And then, because perhaps I wasn't specific enough about that, and I don't think there's just one answer, but especially then, what is the role of civil society in making sure that this concept of co-creation is, again, practical. I mentioned quickly, notions of citizen assemblies, but what are the different ways that we know could be important to really get different voices and participation and engagement, and again, real sharing of rewards. So I'll tackle both of them. On the state, I mean, I've written so much about this, and so I sometimes forget to say the basics, but basically, in many countries, the state doesn't do much, actually. It's not doing its job. And its basic job is funding, the basics. So infrastructure and education, and, making sure that everyone really can prosper with the kind of base capabilities that Amartya Sen talks about, that we have actually no opportunities without basic capabilities. So healthcare, education, living in clean cities. But I think the state, when it's successful, does much more than that. We shouldn't have a public sector that is just thinking of kind of the minimum, right? Just make sure everyone's sort of getting by. So really being able to prosper also means, that actually comes also to your second question, which is, what are the different forums that people actually feel like they really are co-creating value? And I think the state should be also making sure it's funding and creating safe spaces, literally public space, which includes, la piazza, free space for people to mingle, to exchange, to feel safe, to disagree. Oliver Eliasson, who's an artist who I've worked with from Denmark, he talks about the importance of public space as, again, a safe place to disagree. So public museum, including, where he often shows his work. But the state, historically, when it's played a transformational role, including now with the green economy and definitely with the IT sector, was actually investing across the entire value chain. This idea that you can just fund some science and then the VC will come in and commercialize, and then somehow you will get all this great entrepreneurship is simply not true. So in the US, what I wrote about was the state was very active in basic research, applied research, patient long-term finance, dynamic procurement, and then demand side policies. But the second answer, which kind of comes from this, is, well, what was it investing in? If it's just wartime, if it's just suburbanization, right, which was a big demand side policy, suburbanization, that's actually what allowed mass production, which was a big general purpose technology, to diffuse throughout the system. It was a demand side suburbanization policy. Were those good policies, right? So who decides? Where are these decisions, even the moonshots that I talk about, who decides? Is it just the Kennedy moment, a white guy with his, white friends making decisions based on, pet projects or whatever? Or are we willing to say that actually this time, yes, we need moonshots and we need missions, but we need much more diverse voices at the table, even defining what those missions are, but also structuring the system in terms of a kind of a pre-distribution dynamic, which I'll mention in a second, in such a way that everyone also shares in the rewards, right? So this is where I think globally what's interesting are different types of experiments. One is on the voices at the table. So we've been working in Mondragon, by we I mean my institute, where we're trying to help different public actors think through what it means to change the policy space to tilt, not level, to again, kind of really be focused on the big problems and have an outcomes-based economy. We've been going to the Mondragon region because they have a history of cooperatives, right? Which is not only a different corporate governance framework, but it's a different way for citizens, to engage in something like a green transition. And we really go there to learn, but I've been surprised there how little, even in Mondragon, they were able to pass on the values behind the cooperative movement to the young generation. I found a bit of apathy there around that. So, cooperatives are interesting as a model, as are kind of, different types of citizen assemblies. But also what gets exciting is when you think of it not only as making decisions together, but also sharing. So there's new experiments around the world around wealth funds done at the community level. I'm working actually in London here in one of our boroughs in Camden where I live on a citizens wealth fund in Camden because the tax rates coming into Camden, which is just a bit of London, are coming from Google and Facebook because they have put their headquarters here. And the idea is that that tax rate goes into a wealth fund, which gets reinvested back into real community development, but also that the relationship with these companies changes. So their ability to access great resources, which Camden has, it's called there's a knowledge corridor, becomes again conditional on new types of relationships with citizens and the public sector, instead of everyone just giving a handout to Google and Facebook because you want them to come, as happened in New York with the Amazon, you'll remember, deal. But also citizens' dividends, citizens' shares, again, there's a real, I think, fervence of thinking about these kind of three different things. First, how do we make better decisions together so we direct the economy towards what really matters to citizens and who's kind of deciding that? But second, what are the structures along the way that make sure we don't make the mistake that Silicon Valley made, which was socialization of risk, privatization of reward. So the school system in Silicon Valley is one of the least well-funded, which is a crime, given how much public money went into Silicon Valley. And you have a very unequal, access to good education there. And so I think that it's not just about saying the entrepreneurial state or the state is important. It's because it's important, how do we make sure it's really serving the public, right? And that means having new metrics around public value and public purpose. So one last thing I'll say is we've been working with the BBC around this issue because the BBC, a very important public broadcaster, because they've been very ambitious in public broadcasting beyond what RAI does or PBS does, they've always asked themselves, even when they were doing a soap opera or a talk show, right? Not the more classical public broadcasting areas like documentaries or high quality news, how to make sure that the way they were making it, who was making it, the voices, the audience really was as diverse and wide as possible. And they call that public value. And we don't have public value metrics in most state institutions. So at best, it creates some infrastructure. At worst, it just becomes bad infrastructure and part of the problem in terms of, organizing our economies in unsustainable and uninclusive ways.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mariana.
Thank you very much.
And maybe we can move on to our second question by Andrea Kalev, who wants to underscore a little bit, undertake a little bit the issue of the value chain, and in particular in the globalization, in a globalized world. So Andrea.
Hello, dear Mariana. Thank you for your brief but intense lecture. I had a couple of questions for you, but one was more or less already answered, so I will move to the second one, and that's related to the impact of the COVID-19 outbreak and economic globalization. I will give you a little bit of context, and then I will go to the question. So differentiation and specialization, economic liberalization and globalization have all contributed significantly to the well-being and welfare of many people, families, and societies. We all know that cross-country inequality decreased. For example, millions of people in China and India left poverty, but it also increased the so-called within-country inequality. In other words, the economic globalization created some losers and disadvantages some social groups, mostly in the developed economies, but not only there. In the response to the outbreak of COVID-19, many have questioned the current value chain structure, arguing in favor of reshoring some strategic activities, such as medical supplies. You know that many people in the developed world were not able to find masks, for example. According to what stated before, restructuring the value chain of production and perhaps moving it in a more regionally closed territories will exert a significant impact on equality, development, and welfare of different groups. You can think about producers, consumers, savers, and nations, eventually even on peace, as history teaches us. Keeping in mind the great benefit and the related cost, what are your insights related to the last decades and current economic globalization process? Do you see it as an irreversible process, or do we have a choice to rethink it in a different way? Thanks a lot, Mariana, for your insights. We did appreciate.
Great, thanks so much. I realized how thirsty I was. I promise it's not a beer. It's actually a caffeine-free Diet Coke. Terribly healthy. Thank you, Andrea, for that question. I mean, it's such an interesting question. So there's two issues. One is the COVID crisis. I think what it's revealed is, you cannot depend on exports when everyone wants that thing, imports, when everyone wants that thing that you're trying to import. So Italy, I'm actually working with Domenico Arcuri, the Commissario Straordinario. I don't know if you saw the two articles we wrote in Sole 24 Ore side by side on this theme. Italy had zero capacity around PPE. It was importing all of it. And they had a crisis. Now they have 139 companies in Italy producing personal protection equipment, which came from not, again, a discussion, let's do it for purposeful stakeholder reasons, but they were almost forced to, from the way that the Commissario actually organized the industrial strategy around the health pandemic, where they really required urgently material. And so the benefits that were being given actually to some particular companies in terms of the procurement strategy not only was very ambitious in terms of needing the material quite quickly, but also the prices that were negotiated for the mascherine and other things were at a good cost. And this is, by the way, what the military always does. I've looked into how the military funds health in the US, because the health sector gets a lot of money from the government in the US, but then it's sort of a scam, $40 billion going in, as I mentioned before, to medicines, and then the prices and the patents get abused. When the military funds health for soldiers, they're very careful. Everything is negotiated perfectly. It's very innovative. They get what they need from the pharmaceutical industry, which does make a profit. It's not about charity. They make a profit, but it's a healthy, not speculative profit, and the prices are right compared to what the public sector brought in. And it was very interesting how these 139 dynamic kind of SMEs in Italy were able to make money. So they were very happy because they needed to make money to produce something that the government needed. But it was organized through a very interesting kind of industrial strategy where, again, the deal that I mentioned before was negotiated and governed in a very good way because they couldn't afford to get it wrong. But now Italy has this capacity. They didn't have it before. Similar, by the way, with the ventilators. It's a very interesting story. And, Vietnam and Kerala, two developing countries, which, are not as rich as Italy, did very well during the crisis, also because of the state capacity that they have been investing in. And that's more the pubblica amministrazione side of things, right? Because you need both the industrial capacity, you need obviously public sector, also ability to use things like the golden share that I know Italy now is putting into place, but literally the public administration needs to know how to govern. And what I was talking about before in the beginning of the talk about the hollowing out of the state, that's very important because your ability to even govern something like an industrial strategy during an emergency, it not only matters that you have some industry to talk to even make a ventilator, if you use something like the Defense Production Act in the US or the Golden Powers in Italy, but it also matters what kind of capacity literally to govern a system. And it's in most countries didn't have that. It's really quite pathetic, actually. In the UK, we had to outsource to Deloitte the testing, a consulting company, which lost the tests, right? Deloitte is not famous for its ability to do testing. And so I think all these issues intertwine, which is if you deindustrialize, you have nothing to transform with something like the Defense Production Act. And by the way, that act came in 1950 in the US after the Korean War, or during the Korean War, where the US government realized it had to be able to engage industry in helping it fight the war. Similar after, during World War II, that also happened. And what we see in super financialized economies and deindustrialized economies is there's nothing to transform if in the meantime, all you have is financial services. And so I think it is interesting where countries like Italy, where there is still a manufacturing base, but it's a lot of confusion of what the role of the state is, how it takes a healthcare crisis of this proportion to get us kind of to be able to just produce basic stuff, let alone, high-tech digital kind of services. But I think sometimes the deindustrialization question gets, then there's the local and regional aspect, which you mentioned, which is very important. I think this has, again, come up in many countries where it's not that we need more hospitals. We need a much more dynamic, decentralized public kind of healthcare system, which is as good at every point of use. So the care homes, which is where most of the deaths have happened in many countries, are just basket case places in terms of technical and scientific competence. They didn't have ventilators, they had no real knowledge of what was going on, and that's because they have not been seen as part of a dynamic innovation system within the welfare state. But lastly, in terms of industrialization, it's not just about manufacturing. I mean, I often give the example of Denmark, because Denmark is the #1 provider of high-tech green services to China's green economy. And China is spending 1.7 trillion on greening its entire economy, including the IT sector. So they have energy-friendly IT areas. And a little country, Denmark, is servicing it, right? So whereas here, the services we have in the UK are very problematic. Those are the kind of more extractive financial services, which, you know, many are important and they can be structured properly. But still, we've let go of any of these more dynamic services that can help something like the green transition. So I just think all these different issues are important for your question, which is, how do we build a service sector which helps us actually create the kind of, you know, trajectories that we need? We also, of course, need manufacturing, but that doesn't come out of thin air. It comes as a result of, for example, industrial strategy, ambitious industrial strategy, which isn't just about giving money to sectors. It's about making sure those relationships are formed in such ways that I mentioned in the beginning, could use common good and public value metrics.
Thank you, Mariana. So we
Sorry,
know
my
that
answers are way too long. You should give me shorter or easier questions.
It's fine.
Multiple choice.
So we know it's correct that you have to leave in a few minutes, right?
I need to leave, yeah, in about 6 minutes, unfortunately.
Okay, so maybe Maria, if you are on micro, you can make your last question about finance. Thank you.
Fantastic. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrea. And first of all, I'd like to thank Mariana for being here with us. It's a real pleasure to share this webinar with you. Okay, then I'll introduce some questions regarding the limits of the financialization process very quickly. And first, a little bit of background. Until the 1960s, finance was not widely considered a productive part of the economy. It was viewed important for transferring existing wealth, not for creating new wealth. And nowadays, the issue is not only the size of the financial sector, but also its effect on the behavior of the rest of the economy. Even though you have been quite critical towards the financial sector, in your last book, The Value of Everything, you claim the financial sector is critical for buyers and sellers to do business with each other. How these activities can be shaped to actually serve their purpose of producing value is the real question. You assert that what really drives economies and countries forward is the value creation. Could you provide any insights to think how the financial sector should contribute to the value creation process? Then several times you have claimed that we must take advantage of green opportunities and construct sustainable cities because that creates value. My second question for you is, do you think sustainable finance and ESG guidelines are a good path to follow in order to have a more sustainable finance, or it's just another greenwashing activity for corporations to clean their conscience? And finally, my last question, what should be the role of financial regulation in order to steer finance towards a more real and productive use? Thank you very much, Mariana.
That was great. Thank you so much, Maria. Well, so let's start with the greenwashing. There's a lot of it. And I really think, I don't know, Alessandra, if you're still there, but I would love it if your group and, you know, obviously in the way that you support the Pope's words and that wonderful video you showed us of, you know, even though I don't like the word "i poveri," because I think that puts it too individual, we have poor structures which create poverty. But, you know, the Pope is so ambitious and inspirational around wanting to fight against all the areas that are dysfunctional in our economic system that create suffering, that I think you should really help us call out the greenwashing more, and not just the greenwashing, the everything washing. And, you know, one of the issues is, I mean, look at just what's happening now with the vaccine. The World Health Organization is asking that it be voluntary instead of mandatory, because they can't, unfortunately, they can't say it's mandatory. Voluntary, you know, sharing of knowledge between organizations that are racing towards a vaccine. So how we would structure, for example, a pool, a common pool of patents. Instead of allowing patents create secrecy, divisions, and walls in the knowledge creation process for a vaccine, they called for a common patent pool. And I think the fact that it's voluntary is where the problem is. Similarly, with so many of the financial metrics, as long as it's not mandatory, nothing changes. So then people will say, well, how can you make it mandatory? This is, you know, a free capitalist world. It's like, really? It's not free capitalist world. You know how much money and subsidies and guarantees and investments that different types of actors receive from these organizations that are voted on by citizens, right? Democratically elected governments, which set up organizations, whether it's a public bank or something else, or even our central banks. So creating what I talked about before is real conditionalities and mandatory changes in order for any organization to benefit from what is in the end a socially and kind of collective, you know, produced benefit in so many different spaces, from vaccines to, you know, how we think of ESG targets and the transparency around them in order to even get, whether it's a bailout or any other sort of support, or being able to, you know, be listed on a stock exchange if you definitely have reported in a certain way. We're far from that. But I do think the movement is going towards there. But it's those kind of mandatory changes. And I think framing the mandatoriness of it so that it's at the center of the system. So it's not like you're just being kind of whipped on the head with a stick. It's if you want to benefit from the common, the common structures, you will need to change. But in terms of finance, I mean, as I mentioned, you know, it's not only impatient often, and I saw there were some questions about that too. Yes, and I only picked on venture capital because that's the bit of finance that usually people like. And I'm saying even that finance is problematic, let alone private equity and corporate finance of multinational companies that I think Paola Vitale asked about. But there's not only too much impatience and short-termism, but there's often the wrong institutions or problematic institutions. So really rethinking, and that's why I mentioned public banks, you know, which can be called promotional banks, development banks, public banks, and the governance structures in those banks, their mandate and their governance structure is really, really important. And I do think, especially in Africa and Asia, these new institutions are kind of popping up more and more, and they're becoming, you know, in China, without the China Development Bank, you wouldn't have Huawei. Forget the problems now that Huawei is having, but almost all the big important Chinese companies came from patient long-term finance. But then the question is, to do what, right? So this notion of having real citizen engagement, or just call it stakeholder engagement, and having, you know, in the proper way, like on the board of the companies, of the financial institutions, to make sure that the finance is being directed in ways that benefit society, that is just as important. So the governance of the institutions. So one is the long-termism. Another one is, do we even have institutions, if not to set them up? But the governance of those institutions is very important. That's why I mentioned with Cassa Depositi e Prestiti in Italy, I think it is a public bank. It is patient, but it hasn't been as useful as it could be to steer the economy in a particular way. But your question, as well as one of the previous questions, who's doing the steering? Is it just, you know, the big state, the dictator, the benign dictator, the bad dictator? Or what are the new democratic fora that we can make sure are linked to these transformational institutions? And that last point is the most difficult. I know of few experiments. So in Norway, for example, they have a sovereign wealth fund, as you know, that's very large. but it's been a problem, right? They have funded mainly global real estate. They have their little pet projects like in the Amazon, but that's not really their business model. So how do you transform a real business model across the whole value chain and to make it more purposeful and in ways that you're talking about? That's when you stop greenwashing. And the pressure should be from citizens, especially when it's pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, or public banks, that this money goes in the right way, and is also, we turn the tap off. We know how to turn the tap on. It's sometimes harder to turn it off. And how those decisions are made comes down to the governance structures. Yeah, sorry, I went on again.
No, thank you very much. So we know you have to go. So we want to really thank you again, once again, and we want to leave you with it's an idea that maybe you can read about if you don't know, or a suggestion to deep more, just because you gave us many insight, many inputs. So in the Catholic social teaching, and in particular since the works of John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis, has been developed a concept that is called integral ecology. And we guess in our village that this concept can actually work as a very good goal for our society, because it puts together both the respect of the environment, the nature, and environment with its multiple dimensions, of course, and then the nature of the human beings with her and or his dignity. So we wanted to leave you with this small thought, just to give you something back. And thanks again for this opportunity. We're looking forward for your new book. And thank you very much.
Thank you. I love what you just did. It's very original. We don't do that in seminars. We say, okay, thank you. I'm going to leave you with an idea. I feel like you should make a package and make a ribbon, because that's how I see it now.
I know. The idea was to have more time for doing that.
Oh, sorry. But why don't we do that? I mean, we can think of this as a little aperitivo to our relationship, and we can I would love to do that. So with Augusto Zampini, we've been talking about having a more formal collaboration around this concept of the common good, because the work that we do on that says that we need to redefine public goods, because they're currently just corrections for something someone else is not doing. They're not really objectives, big, bold objectives around the public goods. And we need new concepts. So I think your integral ecology concept, I want to know more about it, could be like the process, the kind of intangible, but actually tangible, because we need metrics for it, of how to achieve that, as well as, again, resurfacing the common good approach, which is kind of lost in economics. Anyway, so let's
it would be great. It would be great if we can exchange, and we will reach you. And now we have your email, so we can write to you.
Oh dear, okay. The problem with my email is I get like 600 a day, so it's better if you just call me.
Okay.
Or come and knock at my door. Come and knock at the door, and I'll open the door and invite you to dinner. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mariana, for your time.
Ciao, ciao. Grazie a tutti.
Bye. Thanks to everyone who followed us. We're sorry if we didn't answer to all your questions. We hope we have time in the future to do that. And so it was great. Thank you very much, and have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Ciao, ciao.